Welcome to Security.com, the podcast. We're bringing together in-depth intel, real talk, and the human side of cybersecurity. I'm your host, Dan Mellinger, and we got Paul over here.
Hey, Dan.
Each episode, I'll be joined by industry experts, defenders, and voices from the front lines to explore the latest enterprise security insights straight from the pages of Security.com and the minds shaping the field. Today, we're diving deep into a cornerstone of modern cybersecurity, data loss prevention, or DLP. It's a technology we often talk about, but few people know its fascinating journey from niche tool to industry essential. With me is Matt Jones. He's the Channel Technical Director, Information Security here at the Enterprise Security Group at Broadcom. Welcome, Matt, and could you start with a little bit of your background, and particularly in data security?
Okay, sure, yeah. So it's probably going to age me a little bit now. So my first steps into data security was probably support. So I started off in support, technical support. I lived actually in the time quite close to the Microsoft campus in Reading, in the UK. So, and it was around about Windows 95 time. So at the end of 95, they were recruiting a lot of people to do call handling and stuff. So that was kind of my first entry into sort of the IT sphere, really. Once you've got Microsoft on your CV, it's quite easy to get another job around the area, right?
Sure.
So I went briefly into hardware, so multiplexers and lease lines and all that stuff before the internet was really sort of established as a communication pool. So that was quite a good foundation, really, for sort of the hardware and the physical stuff. Went back into software and then started to work for a little niche company who did add-ons for Exchange at the time, like automatically zipping attachments and that kind of thing when bandwidth was expensive.
Yeah.
Again, I'm going back a bit there.
I remember all of this. That's why I'm laughing.
Yeah, indeed. So, and that was really good. That was a good foundation. Then I went over to, which is probably the big product that you probably remember is ClearSwift's Minesweeper for email. So this is where I started to look at content inspection for email. People weren't really that bothered. They were protecting themselves from viruses, but they weren't really looking out for anything. So they were kind of almost a pioneer, really. And email, of course, was way ahead in the field of communication over web at that point. So then I moved on, worked a little bit in the reseller world. Worked with Symantec DLP for about 15 years or so, and then moved across to Symantec quite recently. So yeah, just sort of landed myself here. But yeah, it's been interesting to see how it grew up. Yeah,
that's awesome. Well, and I wanted to start. So we're going to do kind of a history of data security and DLP, but let's start with kind of the pre-DLP era. So, what was the state of data protection before DLP? You touched on it a little bit, but how did companies manage sensitive data and flows of information, or did they?
I don't think people were really thinking about it, right? So people were putting up firewalls, you got IDS and IPS to try and stop the bad guys getting in. But at that stage, when bad guys got in, it was kind of, they'd run a script. As script kiddies and, the traditional viruses, you got Word, macro viruses and that kind of thing that came in for our email. But I don't think they really considered, the threat of data going out. I mean, of course, you've got user education. That was a big part of it. And, don't leave your confidential documents on the desk or on the printer. And really, that was kind of about it. I don't think really anyone was sort of considering it. I mean, back in the day, of course, you were, making sure that you posted out the information to the right people. But really, when email made it so much easier, you did get mistakes, and I think that's really sort of the turning point, I suppose, of when people start to think about it.
Okay.
I really think you touched on the thing there. When I think about that era, it was like every other issue that we don't have solid solutions for. It really was a training and people sort of problem, right? Like that's how it was approached industry wide. So you're really making me think about this and remember some stuff. Thank you.
Well, so when did regulation start driving the need for, I don't want to say better data protection at the time, but there were some key regulatory pushes that started to classify what data was sensitive and start to give companies more responsibility to steward that data effectively.
Yeah, I think the regulations really pushed the DLP program really. I think sort of I think it was 95, you had the sort of European data protection guidance that was issued. It wasn't really a law, but it was kind of, this is what you guys should be doing to protect your data. Not necessarily from going out, but just to handle it correctly inside. Because you still had, potentially people insider threats, right?
Yep.
And then you had HIPAA, of course, in the US, so the health data needs to be protected, and that was regulated. And then I think it was about 5 years later, about 2000, you had Sarbanes-Oxley. So you had that with, and we were in the UK, we weren't really affected by those two, but of course, managing the financial data was really important. So those came in, and then of course you got the big one a bit later on, 2018 was it? GDPR.
Yeah.
So the rest of the world sort of had to wake up then. I think by then, people were doing a lot more, but that's when the board cared about it, right? Because that's when the big fines came in. The 4% of global turnover, was that something like that? So the threat of financial hardship,
repercussions.
Exactly. So, and of course, it's not just. And whilst that's a European sort of directive, it's not really. Anyone who's handling European data needs to abide by it. So that's when really everyone rushed out and had to do something, right?
Yeah.
If they hadn't already. Generally speaking, we were pretty good by then, I think.
Yeah, and well, it's interesting because that's when companies, they tend to, the hardest or most regulated aspects, they tend to make that the baseline because it makes it easier from an operation standpoint. But it seems to me that was almost like a turning point where instead of worrying about being attacked, they were actually more worried about the data flowing out, right? They had a responsibility now.
Yeah, and it's reputation as well. You hear the news story. Someone's left a laptop on a train, and someone's gone in there and got all the data, or someone's accidentally shipped out a load of customer data. So by that time it was kind of in everyone's minds anyway. But the regulation really sort of sealed that.
What were some of the early, breach types that were different, that kind of shifted thinking to more content-aware security?
I think it was, there was two, I guess, during that time. So you got the insider threat, so the disgruntled employee. It's had enough, he wants to steal all of the company's information. But more, during that phase, it was more about accidental data loss, right? So the well-meaning receptionist sends out the wrong price list to the wrong company or something like that. In fact, when I was in sort of reseller world, I managed a team of consultants, and we built a managed service for DLP, which was really good because a lot of smaller companies didn't really know what to do with it. I'm going to get told off by the SEP guys now, but it's not, DLP isn't really a drop and forget. You have to feed and water it, right? So, so you have to tune the policies all the time. Someone has to go through the instance. But by far the busiest time was the Friday night or Friday afternoon. The marketing person needed to get the report out, wanted to work over the weekend on it, sends it to their Hotmail or sticks it on a USB key or something like that to genuinely, do a good thing, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not really the right way to transfer sort of some sensitive data, right? And just as a shortcut, it's easier to just send it home and work on it then. But so really, it was quite eye-opening actually. The managed service. I mean, some of the stuff people were sending out. I mean, you wouldn't believe it. I mean, just emailing their credit card details for deposits and things, and we've seen whole password. Someone's created a notepad document with all of their credentials in it, just sending it out in plain text. It's like, oh God.
I have a philosophy around this, and links are meant to be clicked.
Yeah,
right. They exist to be clicked, and we can build all this tooling, and we can do a good job, frankly, at mitigating those risks, right? But at the end of the day, the technology exists to do exactly these functions we're talking about, right? So I always try to put a little caveat when I'm talking about our products, because also defense in depth. You should defense in depth. Don't rely just on one product for anything, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, indeed.
But yeah, like your mention of the insider threat side of it, that I remember working with early DLP programs, and that was really the focus. It was just insider threat. They really weren't worried about exfiltration so much as one employee disgruntled wanting to work on it, and how times have changed, right?
Well, indeed, yeah.
Now, fond memories of not being allowed to plug USB sticks into work computers. Well, that kind of moves us on to the birth and early adoption of DLP. So we kind of worked from the 90s to the mid 2000s, roughly. So when did the term DLP first kind of enter the lexicon? When did it become a solution, and what were some of the early companies?
Before you guess, can I guess? I just want to guess at this and see how far off I am.
Go on.
I'm going to say 2006.
So I'm going to talk about the product that I know, which is going to be probably Vontu, which Symantec subsequently bought. But that was 2001.
Oh, that's well before I was involved.
They were created in 2001. I mean, up until now, you had a little bit of DLP capability in some, so if someone you go off and buy an email gateway. Not only is it checking for viruses coming in and spam, etc. Of course, by then they were sort of starting to turn on some additional features, right? So you got file type blocking, don't send X's out or whatever. And also basic keywords. And then you had, web gateways did a little bit of that as well. There wasn't really very much on the endpoint apart from kind of blocking, super gluing USB sticks.
I've done that. Whole companies did that. They would put putty or something in a USB port.
Yeah, totally. But of course, then you've got multiple places to do your policies and your instance. And that's if you change one policy, you got to change it somewhere else. So you get DLP islands, just floating about there. So really, the enterprise DLP type products really came in after that. And because if you bought a web gateway and you bought an email gateway and only one of them does DLP, then you sort of need to shore that up. And you just made an investment. You're not going to buy something else. So you need kind of a single pane of glass, one enterprise level DLP product that can do multiple channels, right? So web, email, endpoint, later on, and discovery and all that kind of stuff. So really, Vontu, I think Symantec bought in 2007. So, but then from then on, of course, we just ran with it, expanded it out. But yeah, it was quite earlier than you thought.
Yeah, that is a change. Like, I know the first time I started working with it was around that time period. So I thought, I was like 2007, so maybe 2006.
So the acquisition, I think what Symantec did was they took Vontu and made it more mainstream, essentially. And so 07 is probably when folks started thinking about DLP as a market, whereas as a technology, 01. They started the company in 01. Now, I didn't really see it until Symantec got it. I think it started as email, as an SMTP relay. But it certainly expanded since then. Okay, well, getting into some of the core technology, there was a tech that exact data matching or digital fingerprinting. Can you explain that a little bit, and how did that kind of change stuff from keyword search? Yeah,
so keywords are great. In fact, people used to put in keywords into Word templates and things in white ink to sort of hide it, but use that as a tag for data going out. So that was sort of early data classification, really. But keywords are great. But if you're looking for, it depends on how well you author the policy, right? Sometimes it takes a long time. We used to get companies going in or consultancy companies going in, putting DLP and putting in some basic policies and then going, disappearing and never seeing them again. And the whole thing lights up like a Christmas tree and it's a problem. So, but keywords on their own, if you're looking for personal information, looking for the word address or the word postcode or zip code or whatever, just going to give you so many false positives or true positives. So by that time, we needed something that's going to reduce down those false positives, and indexing documents is a really good way to do that. So you could go to your legal folder on your share, you could fingerprint all of those documents, and then you can say, right, well, if we see one paragraph of one of these documents, you lifted from a PDF, cut and pasted into a Word document, and we need to be able to find that. And so indexing allowed you to do that. And not only documents that were just kind of in shares, but you could also index databases and that kind of thing. So again, with personal identifiable information, looking for a first name and a last name may not be enough to really trigger as a personal identity, but first name, last name, and address from your customer database, that's really important to block, right? So that's where we started to fingerprint those kind of things and getting way more accurate on the detection. Okay. But you can use them in combination as well, of course.
Yeah, sure.
Well, and the data didn't always necessarily have to leave the network, right? And you talked about it earlier, insider threats, maybe something malicious. So how quickly did it take DLP moving to actual like endpoint devices?
It wasn't very long after. I mean, you got email and web on the network. That was kind of done.
The main vectors, right? Initially?
Yeah,
okay.
That's right. But unless you're in the office, then your email at the time isn't necessarily going to go through that method or through a proxy in the office. You're going to go out through your normal ISP link, right? So having the ability to not only scan data on the laptop or desktop, but be able to look at extra channels, so cutting and pasting, screen print, copy into USB, copy into CD, back in the day.
I was about to say, you're dating yourself again.
No.
I feel like we wouldn't, but...
You say that, but we had I had a customer once that blocked USB.
Yeah.
Excellent. And they found an anomaly in the incidents that were coming through. Someone was putting a load of data onto a DVD-ROM. And they didn't consider that. I mean,
right.
these people still had old laptops that still had that capability. Of course, DLP picked it up, but you just don't think of that sort of stuff, right?
It's like finding a 56K modem in a data center now, right? I mean, when does that happen?
I had that as my ringtone a little while back.
I did too. We're best friends now. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah. The endpoint is a really important part. Print. So you could detect with the endpoint agent. You could say, are you at home or are you in the office? You're allowed to print this kind of confidential document in the office, but when you're at home, you can't.
Yeah.
So that gave kind of an extra dimension really to controlling the data. Yeah.
Was there any challenges? Because I remember early days, compute or installing agents on endpoints was a big deal, right?
Yeah, it was weird actually. I mean, in the UK, people sort of, when they started off on the DLP journey, they tended to go for network, right? So email and web and a bit of discovery. But in Europe, they tended to go for agents first. I mean, I guess it's just a matter of choices over because for example, with email, you could use the endpoint agent to look at email. You could use the network agent to look at email. So you got options there. There's the agent's been fairly lightweight all the way through actually. So there wasn't really any normal clashes. Sometimes you get conflicts with the other software that people are using. Whenever we did a POC, then we make sure that the agent gets installed on one or two machines in all different departments, because everyone in different departments are using different agents and different applications and stuff. So to get rid of those conflicts. But overall, that's it's been fairly stable. Yeah.
What were the first kind of, I guess, killer apps when it comes to DLP technology? So was it mostly about PII or personal identifiable information, intellectual property, or kind of something else?
I think so. I always sort of categorized my customers when I was doing consultancy in sort of three areas. So you had the guys that were regulated. So they were, and the regulations normally circled around personal identifiable information and PCI, so financial data. Okay. So they had to have a tick box, and they had to do that. We had a group of customers that had already had a breach, so they had to rush and try and get something in and tailored. But my favorite customer were the ones that were a bit more proactive. So they weren't necessarily regulated, but as you say, intellectual property is something that everyone misses. You've got CAD designs, you've got network designs, you've got code, source code. There's so many things there that people just don't think about when they're deploying DLP, and then they suddenly think, oh, actually, well, we can add that on as well. So, but the first thing is really the regulation and making sure that the auditors are happy.
PCI compliance, credit card information.
Always starts with compliance.
Exactly, right? Yeah. But it's kind of good because otherwise
makes the case for regulation.
It does. It does.
Well, in Europe, there's plenty of that. But yeah, I mean, if they didn't have a DLP tool because of the regulation, then they wouldn't be able to open it up to protect other sensitive data. So yeah.
Okay. So I guess moving to kind of the 2010s, right? So we're talking about kind of mainstream adoption, 07, things start to kind of pick up a little bit. 2010, the cloud, right, was kind of the big push. So how did things like Office 365, Google Workspace, like how did that change the traditional network-centric DLP model?
Yeah, well, the data wasn't in the network anymore, right? I mean, I think the first customers that moved to cloud was probably Exchange Online, so that preempted Office 365. So people were, and that was normally in a hybrid mode, right? So you had a traditional Exchange server, and then you had it relaying onto Office 365 as a gateway. But yeah, I mean, if you wanted to do a scan of your data in your users' email accounts, then you really couldn't anymore. And then of course you've got SharePoint, which then moved across to online as well. Got OneDrive. All of that stuff was really kind of invisible, and people were uploading documents, sharing them, oversharing them, setting them as public, and the IT guys just had no idea. You could do a scan on your NASes inside the network, but yeah, the leak goes out. So you got things like you sort of have to look at a CASB kind of solution so that you can monitor activity in the cloud. So Office 365 and Google, as you say, and there's plenty of others where once the data's gone, you kind of need to make sure you can track it and still get visibility of it. And really, that's when sort of the CASB kind of products started to come on board.
Well, because to your weekend scenario earlier, right? People were like emailing themselves things or using a USB drive. I remember there was the cloud storage or shadow cloud storage issue with IT where instead folks were uploading it to their private Dropbox account so they can work on it over the weekend. Yeah, and that's still a big thing, I think. I think if you got shadow IT and you got your proxy logs going through that, it really opens up a whole bunch of scary stuff, because most companies would say, well, I've probably got 20 sanctioned apps that we're using, but actually in reality it's sometimes thousands. And most of them are pretty, because they're free, of course, you don't really know how safe that data is. You got no idea where it's being shared or anything. So yeah, a big worry. So you need to, customers needed to really get hold of that. Yeah. Well, and some of the other evolution as things started to mature too is companies started collecting a lot more data just to store on their users, right? On overall traffic, and data became kind of the keys to a lot of companies' profit. And so a lot of this has been centered on kind of the data in motion, right? Catching things as they're moving places they shouldn't be. Sure. How did DLP evolve to like scan and start to classify like these large repositories of data?
Well, yeah. So you can use DLP to look for keywords and phrases and etc. in the documents, but data tagging. We used to refer to it as data classification. It's kind of changed somehow, but yeah. So there were always products that could do tagging. So one of them was, I think, Bold and James and Titus in the US was quite popular, where it's just kind of an add-on to Word. The users could then classify the data. But if you've got a huge bunch of data, what do? I mean, you can use DLP or a classification agent to go and classify that, but you need to build a rule to say, right, well, this type of data needs to be classified to this level. But you really need to get that policy right, because if you just go and bulk classify a million documents and you do it wrong, you have to undo that, right? So the other option is to let the users do it. That comes down to, again, user education. But what you could do is you could build up a policy to say, right, you can't save this document until you've classified it.
Right.
And then you could say in DLP, don't let anything out that isn't classified. So it's a slower rate of classification, but potentially more accurate. But again, you're really in the hands of your education and how well the users are classifying data. We all know that users, in order to get a piece of data out, they're going to underclassify it. Yeah. They're going to set it to public so they can get it out and go home and work on it. So again, you can use DLP to sort of look for those types of data and it's like a backstop and still block that. So yeah, they kind of go hand in hand.
the user side of things as well. So early DLP was notoriously frustrating for users. It would block a lot. There's a lot of false positives. How did it improve over time to be, I guess, more of an educational model versus punitive?
Yeah, so actually, I don't know whether it is the same in the US, but a lot of customers were too scared to block anything here. They didn't want to upset the CEO who wants to get his report out. You don't want to be the guy that's in the messaging team that stop that. So actually, a lot of customers just really wanted visibility of where the data's going. But with DLP, it's not just a hard block or a hard allow. You've got those options. So with email, for example, you can quarantine a message and have that released later on. But based on the content, it's not just blocking Word documents going out. You can go a bit deeper, but of course you've got the user agent and the education piece. So we used to have a little graph we used to show that showed sort of level of incidents, what we call incident squad and DLP matches, sort of on the steady. And then as soon as we deployed something like the DLP endpoint agent, we could pop up messages and say, right, are you sure you're really supposed to be sending this document out? And the user would have to say yes, no, or give a reason. But the incident rate dropped right down as soon as you start sort of reminding users that potentially they're not using the data correctly. Right. People get a little bit big brothery about that. But then you say, well, we're protecting our data, we're not monitoring you as such, so that kind of makes that go away a bit. But yeah, we have the CCTV cameras behind them.
Yeah, right.
There's a little bit of a giveaway. But yeah, so that so that was that kind of helped a lot with the education, and actually it did reduce down the amount of data that was blocked unnecessarily.
Yeah. And potentially just knowing that they can see into that kind of data, you're like, you gotta think twice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, moving into modern DLP and maybe some of the future trends, machine learning, AI, it's helping a lot of industries. Data security is kind of a big data problem in a lot of ways. How is machine learning being used to improve DLP?
So we've had machine learning in DLP for a long time, training sets of data. So you've got, obviously you've got your fingerprinted data, which is data that already exists. You've got words and phrases and those sort of keyword type policies. But you've also got machine learning, which allows you to kind of build up policies based on new documents. So you give it a whole set of, these are confidential documents, and you give it a whole set to train on that these are nearly confidential documents, but not quite. And it kind of reduces down that false positive rate a little bit more. But with AI, I mean, it's a risk. Obviously, uploading confidential data to ChatGPT, for example, is a problem, right? But theoretically, if you've got your DLP policies right, wherever you're sending this document, it should be blocked, right? Yeah. We can do other things and sort of tie it into categories and things like that. But ultimately, I use AI quite a lot to build policies, right? As long as you're not pushing data out there. I mean, if I've been asked to build a regular expression, right. I'm terrible at that. It used to take me days.
Everyone is, unless you're not, and then you're not. You're kind of up here, like nobody knows how you do it.
Regex 101 is a bookmark.
It's a separator.
But no, you just type it in, bang, and it's there, and you're not really uploading any personal, confidential data. Things like if you got HR come to you and say, right, we've got an employee with this particular health condition. We need to block data going out that looks like that. You can kind of type that in and get a load of keywords and drop those into your policy. So it kind of helps, but you just need to be super wary of it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, and 2020, things kind of changed from a business perspective, right? COVID happened, the world shut down, and basically everyone's employees everywhere went remote all at the same time.
Yeah.
The edge became your spare bedroom.
So how did DLP react during that time period?
I think there was a lot of people panicking because I take it for granted. I've had a company laptop for many years now. Right. But some people who work in offices aren't going to have that, right? They're going to have desktops. And now they're at home. how do you protect that data? So, you can use CASB to, if they're using Word Online, for example, to build documents, we can use CASB to look at that and make sure that, there's no confidential data sitting out there. But, people were hurrying to put agents on, so that will obviously help as well. But yeah, it was a troubling time for everyone, right? But of course you got ZTNA or ZTNA. It's a language thing, isn't it? That
ZTNA, zero trust.
ZTNA sort of rolls off the tongue a little bit better, I think. Mm-hmm. But of course, we can use that. So once you've got that deployed instead of the VPN, then you can hook DLP into that, right? So people are still logging onto that, opening their applications, and we still can control the DLP uploads and downloads from that. So we kind of, we had all the tools there. I think everyone was kind of rushing out to. It was just a big panic, wasn't it? Really. But luckily we had things in our toolkit to help out. Yeah.
Well, and to your point, I think a lot of companies were wondering, how well did we classify the data that we had on the front end? Because now this becomes critical to execution when everyone has to go work remotely.
Yes.
Looking back, it's ironic when they send everybody home. I remember very clearly the place I worked at the time. We were watching people leave the building with monitors under their arms and everything else. Yeah. And no one in that moment, because we were all so scared and panicked, stopped to ask the question, well, what's going home? Yeah. Other than the monitor, like what data is, what have we just expanded our footprint for? And that came later, of course. But it was just, looking back, it's a little weird. No one asked that question. And I don't think anyone did at all.
I think, other things were on their minds, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, yeah.
Well, I think a lot of it too is people, especially companies that were mostly in office, were trying to figure out how do we maintain a semblance of productivity if all of a sudden we have to send everyone home. So they were trying to enable at the time, how many Zoom licenses are we allowed to use, right?
Well, that was suddenly video conferencing. You couldn't buy a webcam here.
No.
Well, and you also I've heard it a bunch, actually, funny enough, that DLP is a program, right? It's not a product. So what does that mean exactly? And what role does kind of, you bring in other functions outside of technology in this sense, so.
Yeah. So you have to get the whole company on board. And that's where a lot of DLP implementations break down, I think. DLP isn't really the technology. It's kind of, it's a set of processes. Now, theoretically, if you map your data usage process and all of your other processes into DLP, you'll never see an incident popping up. Of course, we know that's not true, right? Because everyone's human. But early days, it was always the IT guy's problem. The data, that's for IT, right? But you need to start getting departments on board. You need legal there. You need to have like a governance council. Who's going to decide what policies are going to be put in? When are they going to be reviewed? You need a whole working group to decide that stuff. There's so much to it, and it really is the companies that really take and embrace all. The whole company needs to get along and get on board with it. Otherwise, it just doesn't work out. So yeah, and it's not just the technology. The technology drop is a very small piece of it. Once you've installed DLP as a enforcement product, you've got to feed and water it. The policies aren't going to be the same in 6 months. You've got to change them. You've got to do a lot of policy tuning sometimes. Even though we've got policies out of the box, it's every business is different. So you've got to do a little bit of tweaking here and there, and you got to obviously maintain it, update it, all the rest of it, and be aware of all the new features and things. So it's not just a put in and forget. And this is where I came back to in the early days, the consultants used to put it in, put the default policies on, and walk off. Yeah. And then no one looked at it again. But yeah, you really do need a team around you to sort of keep an eye on that and making sure it's all up to date.
Well, speaking of keeping things up to date, looking ahead, right? I like to say that AI has kind of brought about this almost data security renaissance, right? A lot of folks, to your point, kind of took data security for granted. Yeah. Things were in place, but now folks are, in some cases, uploading proprietary databases to LLMs to go crunch and do analysis. So what do you see as some of the future challenges for DLP, and where do you think it's going to go?
Yeah, I think, I mean, AI is going to be all over it, isn't it? I mean, there's two functions with DLP really as a running system, and AI can help with both. So I think in the future we're going to have policies. You've got your paper policies. Why can't you just have AI take that and put it into a DLP policy, right? I need to speak to PM about all my ideas. And then you've got the incident remediation, right? Who you got potentially 2 or 3 people, and sometimes more, that are going through all of these incidents, are coming and checking and making sure they're okay. That's got to be a function that AI can potentially take over. But I think more than that, I think it's going to be products that are able to try and predict what the user behavior is going to be. And that way you're kind of almost, I don't say you don't need DLP, but if you're going to be able to have some sort of agent that's monitoring data, if a piece of data lands in this share, that's never normally happening, so let's automatically generate an incident. So user behavior and being able to analyze and predict what's going to happen there is I think going to be kind of quite big in the future developments.
Interesting. So evolution from keyword blocking to potentially behavior-based analysis.
Yeah. Well, why not?
How often do you find that bringing in services alongside this helps a company get over the hump with implementation? Yeah,
I mean, definitely. It's not, so DLP there's so many channels you can monitor. It's not just a point solution, like I've said before. It hooks into your email, hooks into your proxy, hooks into the cloud. You've got discovery. So you mostly would need some kind of professional services or something to help the initial implementation. But like I said, the DLP managed service that I ran, or managed the team that ran it, was really popular because people didn't want to sit there and go through incidents and tune policies. They didn't really have time, especially the smaller companies. So, and it is in our interests to get those incidents reduced down as quickly as possible, because then we needed less people to do it, right? So you could go in, the traditional consultant would go in, put the policies in, come back a month later, make the changes to the DLP policy, come back another month later. But with a DLP managed service, you're tuning it every day.
Right.
So you get to that result really quickly. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely something you need everyone needs a bit of help with it. Right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, we see similar challenges sometimes with things like app control, some of the more complex to maintain solutions, especially ones that are more in that positive security model space, which DLP counts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I always try to advise people to consider professional services to go alongside the purchase of it, whether it's from us or third party. I'm not even going to tell them where to buy.
No.
But having some sort of consultant that can help could be a big boost.
Yeah, I mean, it's an investment, isn't it? And you got to get the most out of it. And you're not always going to be able to do it yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. And if you could leave one piece of advice, I guess, for our audience on data security, what would it be?
I guess classify your data. Make sure it's accurate, and just have a look around. Look at the gaps, right? Have you got OCR? Have you got some machine sitting in the corner somewhere that everyone's forgotten about that's churning out a load of data? And review the policies as well. I think that's keeping the policies up to date. You might have a merger or an acquisition or something else has changed within the business, and you're still generating thousands of incidents that are no longer relevant. So classification. That's the way forward.
Awesome. And that's a wrap on our data security episode of Security.com, the podcast. Big thanks to Matt for going over that history. Learned a lot. This was super, super interesting. And you can check out more insights and technical deep dives, including a bunch of data security articles on Security.com. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share the show with your fellow defenders. Thanks for listening. And remember, stay sharp, stay curious, and stay human.